In a previous video, we looked at some of the greatest mid-carders of the Attitude Era, and while there were a lot of great names to be found there, this was far from the only era WWE has ever gone through. Yes, before that, slotted right in between the two major boom periods, came the far less appreciated time where the likes of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were on top of the card. But were the mid-carders of this era on the same level as those who had come a few years later? Well, yes and no, because while some of them may have been great, others weren't so much. These, in Forgotten Generation, the new generation era's greatest mid-carders. And if we're going to start anywhere, we may as well start with one of the greatest mid-carders of the whole period, someone who was so good that he probably should have been a main eventer if truth be told, and that's Razor Ramon. Of course, in the years that followed this, Scott Hall would become a bona fide top star over in World Championship Wrestling, but during the mid-90s, he'd instead have to settle for being the top of the second tier as, starting in 1992, he'd play the role of the bad guy, a character heavily based on Al Pacino's portrayal of Tony Montana in Scarface. That said, for as much of a home run of a gimmick as this appeared to be, it would never have worked if it wasn't for Hall's ability to add his signature cool factor to it. And this then led to him becoming a quick hit with the fans as, toothpick in mouth, strutting to the ring, he'd proceed to lay waste to every opponent he came up against, often drawing more cheers than boos from the audience in the process, despite being the heel. So of course, eventually Razor would turn babyface when in 1993, he'd become the Intercontinental Champion after that belt had been vacated. Following this, he'd go on to break new ground in WWF at the next year's WrestleMania 10 when he and Shawn Michaels had their now iconic ladder match. Once that was done then, Ramon was a made man, albeit one who would never fully reach the main event picture as, despite occasionally getting to challenge for the WWF World title, he'd become far more synonymous with the secondary belt, leaving the top prize to be fought over by his clique buddies, HBK and Diesel. And this would eventually lead to frustration for the bad guy as, feeling like he wasn't being used to the best of his abilities, he'd end up leaving Vince McMahon's promotion in early 1996, from there going over to WCW to start the NWO angle. Of course, that would see him reach another level entirely, and it would even see him bring another of his clique buddies over to the Southern Wrestling promotion too, someone who also had made a name for himself as a top mid-carder during the New Generation era, the 1-2-3 Kid. Yes, X-Pac may have been a key mid-card presence during the Attitude Era, but before that, Sean Waltman's prior incarnation was filling up a similar spot on the roster during the mid-90s. This, however, would start with far less fanfare than it had with Razor Ramon as, rather than come in with a superstar-making gimmick, Waltman would begin his enhancement talent, using his impressive in-ring skills to help make others look better. And this would see him initially go through a number of different names such as the Lightning Kid, the Kamikaze Kid, and the Cannonball Kid as, week after week, he'd put over more established talent on episodes of Superstars and Raw. That, though, would all change when on the May 17, 1993 episode of Raw, he'd go up against Razor Ramon himself, with him creating one of the most memorable moments in the show's history here when he was able to beat the bad guy right in the middle of the ring. After that, Waltman would rename himself the 1-2-3 Kid as, loving the idea of a lower card guy getting the opportunity to be more than he was originally slotted as, fans quickly got behind the new underdog star. Of course, behind the scenes though, the Kid was far from the underdog as, being a part of the clique, he'd pretty much get to do what he wanted. And what he wanted, as it happened, was to continue working with his buddy Scott Hall, something which saw the two become a unit for a while after that and, at one point, even briefly become tag team champions together. That said, this wasn't all Waltman was doing as, while he was continuing to work his way up the mid-card, he was also building a backstage reputation for himself as the measuring stick of the company, with it being commonplace at this time for any new signings to be put in the ring with him so as to see if they could go to his standards. Yes, Shawn Michaels aside, out of anyone in the clique, the 1-2-3 Kid may have been the best wrestler, and he would continue to show this during underrated classics with the likes of Bret Hart over the next few years, all up until the point he jumped ship in 1996 and go join Hall and Nash over in WCW for a while. And while he was gone then, it was left to the two remaining clique members to hold down the fort. But given that Shawn Michaels was firmly in the main event by that point, this meant the job of dominating the mid-card would be left to Hunter Hearst Helmsley. That's right, Well, in the years following this, Triple H would go on to become one of the biggest stars in WWE history. Back in 1995, he was still paying his dues as, after jumping over from WCW, he'd quickly make the right friends, something which helped him to get an early push as the Greenwich blue blood heel who looked down upon all of his opponents. And during his early months on the roster, these opponents would include the likes of Henry Godwin, Bob Holly, and Duke the Dumpster Droese, the former two of which we'll get back to later. Sticking with Helmsley for the meantime, though, after proving to the boss that he could go in the ring, he'd be slated to win the 1996 King of the Ring, something which was largely seen as a signal that he'd be moving up to the main event scene sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, though, his progress would be stalled when, on Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's last night with the company at a house show in Madison Square Garden just a few months prior to this, 4 of the 5 Kliq members would take part in the Curtain Call, a moment which saw them break kayfabe and embrace each other in the ring as friends. And this would upset a lot of old-timers behind the scenes, many of whom saw it as a disrespectful act towards the business. So knowing he needed to punish someone for the act, but being unable to do anything to Hall, Nash, or Michaels, with the latter being the WWF champion at this point, the sword would instead fall on Helmsley. This meant that his planned King of the Ring victory would be cancelled, instead being given to Steve Austin in a moment that probably worked out for the best in the long run. For Paul Levesque, though, the man behind the Triple H character, it meant he would have to spend much of the remainder of that year enduring various on-screen punishments which included his complete burial at the hands of the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 12. But even as he was going through this, he understood that if he could just grin and bear it for long enough, his time would eventually come again. And true enough then, by October of 1996, he'd have officially left the doghouse when he became Intercontinental Champion for the first time. After that, he'd continue to rise up the mid-card, taking part in very memorable feuds against the likes of Mick Foley and Rocky Maivia, all while gaining a new bodyguard in the form of Chyna while he was at it. Then, as 1997 was drawing to a close, he'd team up on screen with Shawn Michaels, creating D-Generation X, the group that would eventually take him that last step up to the main event. Of course, while 1997 turned out to be a good year for Hunter Hearst Helmsley, it would become far more associated with the rise of another superstar. But before he became everyone's favorite anti-hero, Steve Austin would enter WWF as the far less essential The Ringmaster. Yes, even the best of them have to start somewhere, and for the Rattlesnake, this would mean joining WWF in late 1995 as the newest protege of the Million Dollar Man. And it should go without saying then that this one was dead on arrival, because despite being given the $1 Million title and the full sign of approval from Ted DiBiase, Austin would have very little to work with as, being specifically told not to talk during promos, the verbal skills that helped make him famous would get no opportunity to shine. On top of that, while he did have some good matches, there would be little chance to let loose with the intensity everyone later came to know and love him for, as, playing someone whose gimmick was that they were a good hand in the ring, it meant a lot of technical wrestling with little added flair. Luckily then, after realizing the character was going nowhere, Austin would request it be changed up, with Vince McMahon eventually agreeing to this and allowing him to morph into more of a cold-blooded killer-style gimmick based on serial killer Richard Kuklinski. And this, as it turned out, would be just what the rising star needed, as after becoming Stone Cold Steve Austin, he'd quickly rise up the card, winning the King of the Ring in 1997, and there cutting his now iconic Austin 3:16 promo. Following that, there was no stopping him because, with fans falling more and more in love with his anti-hero antics every week, it wouldn't be long before he was the biggest star on the show, getting into memorable feuds with the likes of the Hart family and Rocky Maivia, all while becoming a 2-time Intercontinental Champion, and by 1998, a World Champion too. Yes, it was a fast rise to the top for Stone Cold once that final piece of the puzzle fell into place. It's just a shame then that the same couldn't be said about one of his opponents during this period as, while he was also a good wrestler, Sergio Vega never really hit hard with fans in the same way. But then maybe we're being unfair by comparing him to the biggest star in wrestling history, as it wasn't like Savio didn't have success in the WWF mid-card during the mid-90s. No, in fact, he'd be able to carve out a nice spot for himself after taking up the role in 1995, first by teaming up with Razor Ramon for a while, and then by going it solo as he set his sights on becoming the Intercontinental Champion. Despite his best efforts to win this belt throughout 1996, however, he'd ultimately be unable to do so, with him instead having to settle for having a great feud with Steve Austin that saw the two at one point put on a very underrated Caribbean strap match at In Your House 8, Beware of Dog. Following that, he'd continue to be a presence on the mid-card, usually putting on solid matches whenever he was called up, with all this eventually leading to him getting his own stable, Los Boricuas, in 1997, as part of the ongoing faction warfare storyline being played out at the time. And he wasn't the only one who was taking part in faction warfare around that time either, as it happened. Of course, even before he became a part of the Hart Foundation, Owen Hart was already proving that he had it in him to be one of the best wrestlers on the planet. And this would all really get started in 1993 as, despite having been a lower-card tag team act with the likes of Jim the Anvil Neidhart and Coco Beware prior to that, the runt of the Hart litter would get his first real break then when he began aligning himself on screen with his brother Brett. Over time, however, jealous of all of Brett's success, Owen would begin to grow frustrated with his older sibling, with this eventually leading to him turning on him at the 1994 Royal Rumble and starting one of the best storylines of the era. Yes, this was the period that saw the Harts go to war when, over the course of 2 matches at WrestleMania 10 and SummerSlam 1994, Brett and Owen would put on 2 absolute 5-star classics. And to make matters even better for the younger brother, he would be able to prove his skills when he got the win during round 1 of these, as, at the Showcase of the Immortals that year, he'd open the show by pinning the Hitman. And of course, Brett would win the WWF title later that night. This meant Owen would get a shot at this too in a steel cage match at the aforementioned SummerSlam show, a match he ultimately wouldn't win, but one which would solidify just how good the King of Hearts really was. But then he'd already shown this by winning the 1994 King of the Ring a few months prior. And as the months went on from there, he'd continue to prove his worth when, at a house show, he'd even briefly get a phantom WWF title win himself. After that, though, he'd drop back down into a mid-card role as, after partnering with Yokozuna, he'd become a 2-time tag team champion. Following this, he'd end up aligning himself with his real-life brother-in-law, the British Bulldog, with that eventually leading to the Hart brothers mending fences and the Hart Foundation reforming as a stable in 1997. And it was during this period that singles gold would finally come Owen's way as, after beating Rocky Maivia, he'd become the Intercontinental Champion for the first time. That said, he wasn't the only mid-card act who would become a notable IC champion during this period, as prior to this, Ahmed Johnson had staked his claim at that very belt. Before he would get there, though, the Pearl River powerhouse would have to work his way up the ranks, as after joining WWF in the summer of 1995, he'd go through a number of early opponents, such as Yokozuna, Jeff Jarrett, and Buddy Landel. Come mid-1996, however, Johnson would be ready for the next step as, at that year's King of the Ring pay-per-view, he'd quite literally mow through the Hardy Boys on his way to the ring where, once there, he would destroy Goldust and become Intercontinental Champion. Following this, he'd begin being paired up on screen with the likes of Shawn Michaels and Psycho Sid, making it seem like it was only a matter of time till he rose to the main event. In the end, though, this would never quite happen as, with a series of injuries constantly befalling him and apparent backstage issues souring management on his potential, Ahmed would instead remain in the mid-card, there feuding with the Nation of Domination well into 1997. Still, despite his lack of a main event spot, fans would continue to get behind the big man for a while. That was until he turned heel in June of '97, of course, joining the Nation he'd been feuding with for so long, and pretty much killing any interest audiences had in seeing him from there. But while that may have been the beginning of the end for Ahmed, at least he did get to rise high up the mid-card for a while, the same of which can't really be said for Henry Godwin. Yes, we did say we'd get back to him eventually, and now's the time, as during the mid-90s when Vince McMahon was still enamored with the idea of wrestlers having jobs, Mark Canterbury was saddled with one of the worst of them all, a pig farmer from Arkansas who'd come to WWF to help out Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation. So trying to make the best he could of the whole thing then, Henry Godwin, as he was now known, would become a regular on the company's mid-card, often bringing his tin can of hog swill down to the ring with him and using it to embarrass his opponents, one of which would be Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who memorably faced Henry in an Arkansas hog pen match at In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings. After that, he'd be joined by his kayfabe brother Phineas as together they'd become tag team champions for a while. Of course, this run would end up being short-lived because after coming up against the Legion of Doom in the spring of 1997, the Hog Farmers would find themselves being thoroughly outmatched. And to make matters worse, it was during a match with Hawk and Animal that Henry would suffer a broken neck, with this occurring after a botched Doomsday device saw him fall right on his head. And while he eventually would return after that, he was never able to find that same level of success again, as with the new generation having come to an end at that point, the days of him and others like him were finally over. Of course, one of the other figures who found themselves being thrown to the wayside at this point would be someone for who Vince McMahon initially held high hopes, and that was Adam Baum. But as history has since shown us, Adam Baum did not end up becoming a big star. No, instead, he turned out to be someone who had a brief run in the mid-card, all before then disappearing from the company altogether. That said, during his run, he at least got to have one of the more memorable entrances of the time, as after debuting in May of 1993, he would start coming out to the ring with pyro designed to resemble the mushroom cloud created by an atomic bomb. Yes, it was clear that, at least during those early days, Vince McMahon saw something special in Adam as, with Johnny Polo by his side as his manager, he would go on a string of early victories, all while further explaining his character as having been a survivor of the 3 Mile Island incident. And in perhaps the most surprising turn of all, this turned out to be somewhat based in reality, as having grown up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, not far from 3 Mile Island, Brian Clark, the man portraying the gimmick, would be all too familiar with the nuclear meltdown which had happened there in 1979. Still, this didn't help him get over with fans, as in the months that followed, Adam Baum would start to flounder, with him at this point dropping Johnny Polo as his manager and replacing him with Harvey Whippleman instead. After that, he'd fail to win at both the 1993 Survivor Series and the 1994 Royal Rumble, with all this eventually leading to him getting squashed by Earthquake in just 34 seconds at WrestleMania 10 that March. Luckily then, another of his fellow New Generation era mid-carders would have a much better time of it because before he was hardcore, Bob Holly would make an early impression as Thurman Sparky Plugg. Yes, it was a terrible name, but right in line with what Vince McMahon was doing at the time, as after signing Holly up to a contract in 1994 and realizing that he was something of an auto racing aficionado, the boss would create the character of a NASCAR driver specifically for him. So running with this then, Bob would start working his way through the WWF mid-card soon after, building up a reputation for himself as a solid hand, all while quietly changing his name to the slightly more palatable Bob Sparkplug Holly. And so high did his reputation eventually get that by the 1995 Royal Rumble, he and his temporary tag partner, the 1-2-3 Kid, would have become tag team champions together. Of course, this reign would only last for one day, as they would drop the belts to the Smoking Guns on the following episode of Raw, but regardless, it solidified Holly as a key player in the company's mid-card going forward, with him picking up further wins after this over the likes of Jeff Jarrett and even earning a Phantom Intercontinental title run in the process. That, however, would be the highest peak he would reach during this era, because come 1996, he would have largely disappeared from TV, with him only making sporadic appearances between then and 1998, at which point he would morph into a new, more hardcore incarnation of himself. And while he was away, the last New Generation mid-carder we're going to be looking at today would have a brief rise of his own, as after jumping from Extreme Championship Wrestling in 1996, Too Cold Scorpio would be rebranded as Flash Funk. Yes, with his colorful outfit and funkettes by his side, he'd slowly dance his way to the ring, all before stepping through the ropes and taking on a series of mid-card opponents. Of course, if you've forgotten this one, it's probably because it didn't last very long, as after a few months of floundering, Flash Funk would revert back to his original Too Cold Scorpio moniker, from there going on to have a decent mid-card run during the Attitude Era too. And that's a good place to end today then, because while he may not have been a main event player during the mid-90s, Scorpio, as well as everyone else we've looked at in this video, were all able to prove that so long as you can carve out a role for yourself, even if you're not winning world titles, you can still have a key position on the show. And this in itself can be enough to make sure you're never forgotten. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.